Gold price additionally rose last week, hitting a new all-time high near the mark of $2,200. The unemployment rate in the US rose from previous 3.7% to 3.9% in February, reinforcing hopes that the US Fed will start cutting US interest rates in June. US stock prices also gained last week, with USA 100 and USA 500 hitting fresh all-time highs. Crude oil price finished last week's session below the mark of $80, while natural gas price made its first attempt to return above the mark of $2. With the commodity markets, Palladium gained more than 10% last week, experiencing one of the best weekly sessions lately. The markets turned their focus this week onto US inflation data for February, which come out higher than expected, 3.2% versus 3.1%. The data is expected to add pressure and anxiety as it came out days ahead of the next Federal Reserve Monetary Policy meeting, March 20th. Fed Chair Jerome Powell has mentioned on several occasions that before they start cutting rates, they want to be sure that inflation is on a sustainable path towards their target of 2%. Later this week, U.S. retail sales data for February and U.S. Michigan consumer sentiment for March will be released on Thursday and Friday, respectively. Tesla lost around 15% last week, hitting its lowest price since May 2023, near the mark of $170. Tesla came under pressure after reports that its Berlin Gigafactory had to halt production due to power outages. The timing of production resumption was still uncertain. Tesla investors had another reason to be nervous about, and that is Tesla's quarterly delivery data for Q1 of 2024 that is due to be released the first week of April. The Tesla stock has lost around 30% in 2024. Nvidia finished last week down by around 5.55%, marking its first weekly negative session after a winning streak that stretched over 6 weeks. Nvidia turned red last week after first testing a fresh all-time high above $970, approaching the market capitalization of Apple. Later this week, the Nvidia stock price could be expected to rise due to volatility, as Nvidia GPU Technology Conference is due to start on March 18th and will continue to March 21st. Nvidia's CEO, Jensen Huang, will open this year's conference with a speech regarding artificial intelligence. Nvidia stock has risen around 90% since the beginning of the year. The crude oil price lost 3.47% last week, finishing the session around the mark of $77. Earlier last week, crude oil once again tried to break through the mark of $80 to the upside, but it failed to stay above its long-term resistance. Crude oil fell despite some favorable news that usually provides support to prices. OPEC+, which controls around 50% of total global oil supply, agreed to keep their current production cut policy in place in the second quarter of 2024, while Israel and Hamas failed to reach a ceasefire deal ahead of Ramadan, keeping tensions in the Middle East high. Later this week, the International Energy Agency, IEA, will release its report on Thursday. Gold remained in the spotlight last week, adding more than 4% as it hit a fresh all-time high of $2,194.96. Gold rose as the U.S. unemployment rate jumped to 3.9% in February, up from previous 3.7%. Earlier this week, investors turned their attention to U.S. inflation data, which came in higher than expected, 3.2% versus 3.1% exp. On Thursday, retail sales data for February will be released in the U.S. Gold has increased around 5.5% in total in 2024. Palladium gained more than 10% last week, marking one of its best recent weekly sessions. Palladium returned above the mark of $1,000 as data in China, the largest palladium consumer in the world, showed stronger than expected trade figures for February. In fact, Chinese exports rose 7.1% last month, exceeding analysts' estimates for an increase of 1.9%. Imports in China also exceeded estimates, jumping 3.5%. Palladium traders will be next focusing on China industrial production data for February, due to come out on March 18th. The EUR-USD rose to its highest rate in 2 months, testing levels above 1.0950 for the first time since January. The euro rose last week after the European Central Bank kept its benchmark interest rate unchanged at 4.5%, while the US dollar came under negative pressure after data in the US showed that unemployment has risen to 3.9%. Earlier this week, inflation data in the US showed higher than expected figures, 3.2% versus 3.1% ex-ap. In addition, US retail sales for February will be released on Thursday at 12:30 GMT.